Managed to come to this lecture by Nigel Coates. It's a great pleasure. It's great to see that despite all the end-of-year pressures, lots of people have managed to come to this lecture by Nigel Coates. It's a great pleasure to welcome Nigel back to the AA. We were going to have a lecture from Nigel, I think, a few years ago, and sort of it's taken all this time to get him to come for the lecture. And I'm glad that tonight's lecture coincides with the recent publication of his book, Exploring Ecstacity. It's work that relates to, I suppose, some of the explorations that Nigel was involved with all those years ago, and I know that there was actually, in fact, a small publication that was done here, and it follows a series of interests to do with issues of pleasure, city, the body, all those wonderful things that that Nigel has always been very fond of over the years. After leaving the AA, where he studied, and he also was a unit master, Nigel went on to set up Branson Coates Architects, established NATO, and then later on, since 1995, has been the professor of architecture at Royal College of Art. He is really the figure that has brought so much of the conversation about urbanism and about alternative life of the city to our attention. And tonight I think he will focus primarily on the book and the structure of that, and the way that it represents many of his fascinations. It's a great pleasure for me to see him here, since we were studying and teaching together. So please welcome Nigel Coates.
Thank you, Mohsen. Gosh, what a pleasure to be back here. I know this building so well that when I went down to the loo downstairs in the basement just now, I found myself skipping down each step, knowing exactly how to turn on the newel post at the bottom of the stairs, glance into the bookshop, and then whip into the loo, where you've got a new condom machine, I note. Well, as Mohsen said, I came here in early 70s, studied with Bernard Tschumi, and well, it was literally every day that I came here for 18 years, something like that. I know every part of the route through the underground to get here and all that. But since I've been at the Royal College, Boyce and I invite each other to dinners now and then, and I've been putting a lot of energy into that. But it's true that a lot of what I've got to show you this evening really does stem from the time that I studied here, and with the incredible coincidence of vision that occurred for many of us teachers at the time, with Zaha, Rem, Dalibor Vesely, many other teachers who were here during the early 70s through to the mid-80s, largely under the guidance of Alvin Boyarsky, who I'm sure you will have heard many times had an enormous influence, not just on us here, but the way we've gone forward from here, and hopefully infected, inspired architectural work in Britain, which I think is the country which has spawned more international effect and change in architecture, even if you can't necessarily see it on the streets of British cities. Anyway, I'd like to begin, and it's true I'm going to talk about my book, but I'm not just going to kind of try to capture every element in it. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the nature of making a book. And I brought a few books along. This one is a facsimile edition of a book that was published in 1499 over 100 years after Dante's Divine Comedy. It's called the Hypnerotomachia Polyphony, which is a contraction of ideas about love and dreaming. It was written by a priest and is a kind of journey with gorgeous illustrations that posit the idea that a real landscape can actually be a landscape of fantasy. So I bring this today, first because it's big, and I think you might be able to see it, and secondly because there's a conception in that book which I found inspiring. The second book I want to show you is one that was very influential to my fellow students and Bernard Tschumi. This came out, I think, in 1971. It says Nigel Coates, May 75, inside the cover. Invisible Cities, Città Invisibili, by Italo Calvino. A book which I hope, if you haven't read it, you will have time to look at. But it charts the description of many cities that, that Marco Polo is describing to Kublai Khan. He's describing the cities that exist in Kublai Khan's empire, and each one of them apparently is different. But when you get 2/3 of the way through the book, you realize that all the cities he's describing are actually Venice. So there's a book with a mathematical structure, but with an incredible level of poetry. Now here's completely the other kind of book, a guide to Brussels, which is reputed to be the most boring city in Europe. However, if you would look at a book, any time out guide like this, you'd see that it would have lots of pictures of aspects of daily life in Brussels. There's a picture of a doorway, so it's got architecture in it. How about that? And it's got adverts and gay and lesbian views and somebody half naked. And the point is that any guidebook will try in some way to encapsulate what a city is. And I think it does it in a very interesting way. It does it in a way which will empower the reader, we hope. That you could read the bits of it that you are interested in. So you may not read about the history of Brussels architecture, but you might read about the food, or you might read about the nightlife. So the structure, we take this kind of book for granted, but in actual fact, it's an interesting structure that attempts to encapsulate that one city. Then I'm going to do a bit of promotion here for one of the books that we did at the Royal College of Art. Like the AA, we publish a book like this at the end of each year, and this particular one, like all of them, was designed by some first-year graphic designers. First year at the Royal College means fourth year here. And, of course, they like to play, as graphic designers, with the concept of the book. So they've made the book in bundles, but it has no proper cover. So each bundle is about one of our studios, similar to your units, and in a way, the book is a piece of architecture. It tries to reflect the nature of our department. Much smaller than yours. We've only got 50 students. And then, of course, the pièce de résistance, the book that you cannot miss, Guide to Ecstacity, which in a way is a fusion of all the books that I've just shown you. It has a travel tag, a luggage tag as a band around it. And if I were to take that off, it looks a bit like a Bible, and it's beautifully inlaid. And you think, my God, this is a very serious-looking book. But maybe it's one to keep by the bed alongside the Bible itself and the Quran. But when you open it up, it doesn't look anything like the Quran or the Bible because it's full of colours and hopefully the energy of a real city. To introduce this, I'm going to show you a movie. And I'm just trying to find full screen movie, half-size full screen. Here we go. It just lasts for 10 minutes. So it was done for a show that Zaha and Patrick Schumacher organized in Graz in Austria a year and a half ago. And it was shown as an installation on 6 plasma screens that were organized in a semicircle at head height. So rather than seeing a movie in a conventional way as you're seeing it, imagine that this strip was split into 6 different screens, and that you could only see it surrounding you, so that it would come out towards the limits of your visual field. And it explains the basic proposition of Ecstacity, that it is a fusion of 7 cities around the world, which I've kind of freely chosen because I like them, or I've been to them, or I think there's something ecstatic about them. And, well, the book proposes that these elements have been fused together into one place.
I'm Francesca, but my friends call me Fran. I'm a second-year student, polytechnical in general, and I'm studying multimedia. This is my first trip to Ecstacity. I think I'm the last of my friends to go. I feel I know it already from films and books, but I've been doing lots of research on the web. I downloaded the Extra Metro map and stuff, and it seems easy enough to get around once you've figured out the basics. I'm landing at Heathrow because there's a direct Extra Metro link to Times Square where there's lots of cheap accommodation. I hear that Saha International has really long queues and takes ages to get to customs. It was hard to decide exactly when to make the trip. My brother loves June in Ipanema, and my mother likes to go in August so she can stock up with winter clothes from Bond Street or Fifth Avenue. I wanted to go in February for Holly, which sounds wild, but I couldn't get a flight. When I get there, I want to see all the obvious stuff, like the Money Cat and the Coliseo, which I think are all pretty much in the center. I probably won't have time, but if I do, I really want to make it to Corcovado. I've seen postcards and things of luminous monuments flying over each other, but everyone says there's nothing like seeing it in the flesh, like the Northern Lights or something. I've got a few friends there already, Georgian and Rizzi, both are after college because of all the mixed cultures. My best friend Luke is a graphic designer who thinks he's a real mixed citizen after just 2 years. He insists on speaking Exlish on the phone, which I guess he thinks is cool. He says I'm a hick for not understanding it. They say it's like living in all the best cities rolled into one.
I'm Craig. I'm an architect from Ghana who got to Ecstacity 3 days ago. I'm here for work, but I've got the afternoon off before I go on the bus tour to get something real good for it. I'm not that into the old stuff like Big Ben, Ganesh, so I've chosen one of the funkier tours that includes Gary Guggenheim and the Selfridges Museum of Shopping. I've already got the feeling that Ecstacity is held together by the River Felix and Mars and Venus Hills. My favourite landmark has got to be the Colosseum where, believe it or not, they have wide valleys posing to restore it. I'm staying in the London zone at the Sanderson, but my meetings are in the Roma area, near San Pietro. I could have got a hotel over there, but hey, I was in a photo. Besides, the Exeter Metro is pretty quick. And if I'm late or can't be bothered figuring out the address, there's a cab driver who really know their way around. Some zones have regular street numbers, but the others have a zone number like a barcode. These locate precisely, including the level above the ground. Most people speak English, but that too has lots of variation. My taxi driver last night spoke English, a mixture of English and Hindi. After a while, you sort of understand if you can get them to repeat it. Yesterday evening, I went for a stroll in Hyde Park, and dozens of different languages. I went to Sophia Hands in Sheffield, it's amazing. It's got every DIY trick and gadget you could imagine. I came out with tons of stuff I'll probably never use. There's nothing like that in Ghana. I'll be gone by Saturday, which is a pity. I'll miss the markets for the weekend, like Portobello and the one outside the Cairo Gate.
They call me Lil, and I do a bit of fashion and a bit of writing and a lot of looking after people I don't really do nor want to know on a job. In Ecstacity, you don't feel as intimidated by the buildings as you do in most places. It never occurred to me till recently that my body's a building too. Well, you live in it, don't you? Ecstacity makes you realize that you're part of the architecture, which is why I like to dress up. It gives me a kick to see other people wearing my clothes. But the other day I saw an something I'd done plastered all over the place that I talk about. Lots of the buildings here are sexy, and I'd love to dress them all up. There's a building near Hyde Park that looks like it's made of giant clothes. No matter where you go, the city oozes flesh and blood, and I don't just mean the people. That's got more so as almost jelly plastics start to be used in buildings. Lots of them keep changing, or you might say, growing, and others are on the decline. Often the streets, pathways, and buildings all blend into one another, and other times there are buildings that are like real people. There are several that are giants, no less. And if you go into them, the furniture often looks like the body parts too. Most people here like to interact with the world around them. Ex-citizens don't want to live in a world of rectangles and super square sofas. They like birds and sexy touch to things. Even if there's a lot of getting dressed up in Ecstacity, there's a feel for undressing too, and I don't just mean the bedroom. Ex-citizens are very undressed sort of people. We feel comfortable with our bodies and like to live in them to the full.
I'm Ali. I was born in Texas. I first came to Ecstacity to visit a friend, and somehow I never left. I split my time between working for an ad agency and publishing a magazine. I do a bit of art too. Mostly I hang out in Tokyo and Mumbai zones, in other people's studios by day, friends' houses and clubs by night. Sometimes I spend all night in the park. Every now and then, I just go wandering, usually on foot, on my own. I open the front door of a shop and come out by the loading bay. One time I was wandering recently. I was out all day, well into the night. At one point I found myself on stage at a West End musical, and then minutes later, I was under a tunnel at the Palatine. This is a great way to meet people, even if you're not interested in being shown the way. If someone does insist on giving me instructions, I deliberately head out in direction. Some days I spiral, some days zigzag. Other days I concentrate on smells, or follow people. Surprisingly enough, I managed to feed all this wondering into my work. I think of it as research. One part of the city I never get tired of is the market around Caladevi. It's so big, you never see the same thing twice. In the summer, I usually finish up at the beach at Ipanema. As you know, the beach is more like a park than a place to lie and get fried. It's very social. People just stand around, chat, eye each other up. There I usually run into some of my friends. And when the sun goes down, we go off to bar in the back streets. By this time, I'm not usually in a gang. More often than not, something unexpected happens. Last week, I finished up having sex with a girl in a caravan, just parked on the roadside. I could write a book about all the mad encounters I've had here.
Hi, I'm Melanie, and I was born in Northern Ireland. Moved to Ecstacity 5 years ago, where I lived in the Moondown and New York zones until 2 years ago. Then I moved to the burbs, so have a lot of my friends. Most of my work happens at night and on the hoof. I moved out from central Ecstacity because the people and the culture are just too dense. Sometimes you've got to escape history in order to appreciate it. The burbs fit my lifestyle much better because I'm constantly reinventing it. I live in an oyster house with a bunch of people that work in the creative industries, except for Richard, who works at Heathrow. Although we all have different hours and work patterns since our schedules change weekly, we managed to come up with lots of new social events. We invented a computer program for this, so all we have to do is feed in our schedules, and these are matched with what's going on. Last week, we had a whole lot of friends over for a truffle fest, and next week, we're plotting a Bollywood banquet. Often I confuse work and play. You get the same feeling about the architecture, that it's serious and playful at the same time. In the burbs, lots of buildings grow and change organically. Ecstacity policy is buildings should reflect their users as much as possible. We are encouraged to break the codes. What people here really seem to go for is the hybrid. I just started working on casinos to its gas stations, including drive-by slot machines in the car park underneath. Then you could tip your winnings into the methane tank. Brands is diversified in the burbs, although several districts have big brands running them, like the D&G district near Wembley. Most of them want to facilitate rather than feed into brand machines. That doesn't mean desire isn't here. To the contrary, it's everywhere. The hypos that float over the city are all there, because people are keeping them alive and moving. Every time one of us SMSs the code for each forum, it helps keep the thing afloat.
My name's Ned. I was born here, although I did engineering at university and an MBA to follow that. I'm currently researching the whole concept of research. The real and virtual coexist here in ways that never expected. Every aspect of Ecstacity has got a techno underbelly, but it's got flesh and bone too, if you know what I mean. I'm happy in my own skin, and it's because I've become part of Ecstacity and it's kind of part of me. Nevertheless, the city keeps me on the edge all the time. The unpredictable always creeps in somehow. Everybody does that thing, but we're all willing to share it with others. Sometimes I go to clubs because I think they're the most real places in town. They're the melting pots for the city. Most of them have a very particular mindset, like the people and the music. The surroundings just have to suit the feel and, of course, help create it. But unlike immediate uprange of products or a legislated lifestyle, a club should just be a consumer experience. Fat cat companies have tried that and it doesn't work. I like to collect stuff, but never for the sake of amassing it. I try to give away more than I acquire. I think the most important part of collecting is to figure out differences between superficially similar things like email addresses on my laptop. In Ecstacity, architecture, politics and lifestyle seem to meld into each other as one flirtatious melting pot. The usual hierarchies of other places seem to be flattened out. Everything, everybody are in constant flux. From here, the elemental 20th century city seems outdated as SimCity or McDonald's. Brands form and reform. It's gone beyond the artificiality of most Western cultures. In the end, it's all in your mind and on your tongue.
Well, I don't expect you to read that tiny script. As I said, each one of those panels was a plasma screen. So now I'd like to move to conventional way of showing. Okay. So what I thought I'd do was go through a series of sections that somehow explain the nature of the book from different viewpoints. So I'll show you a series of spreads that include the little tassel hanging out at the bottom. This is near the beginning of the first chapter and is very conventionally guide-like, where on the right it has sections that refer to climate, currency, language, tipping, children. On the next page it's older visitors and other sections of society and how they might deal with this city. And in the middle I've got this wheel by Langlands and Bell which has the call letters that they've chosen to be in this particular interpretation of the world. So, you know, obviously you would have got it already that there's a global nature to Ecstacity, though, within a city. And also near the beginning of the book, that moment when you come through the the barrier after collecting your luggage, and you see all those people lined up, the meeters and greeters, and usually, of course, there's no one there to meet you. But there are some interesting people lurking in here, including this one up here, who turned out to be Martin Bell. So you even spot, you spot the famous people after you've taken the picture. This is an interpretation of Ecstacity that we showed at the Venice Biennale in the year 2000 in the British Pavilion, and contributed a lot to the way that the book developed its ideas of 6 chapters. Some of the chapters you've seen in the film. The floor of the room was covered with reflecting black dance floor, and in the center of it, which corresponded to the locking on section of the film, was an enormous map turned upwards with a series of our projects and some souvenirs from various parts of Ecstacity on these little light box shelves. So it had the Colosseum in model form representing the Rome zone, and the Ganesh representing the Bombay zone, and some little pieces of our design in the form of miniature versions of our vases that were pretending to be buildings, and then some 20 of our projects in teeny model form. Then at the ends of it, it was a completely symmetrical space, but you could enter from either end, and the thesis that you've seen in the film was, as it were, unfolded at either end of the room. This was the part that was about letting go, and a computer-controlled sort of neon installation with little TVs all over it that promoted the idea of wandering in the city. And in the book, this is posited as a permanent installation that's in a Conran restaurant in Wapping, which is, curiously enough, housed in one of our first buildings, the Arc du Noé. So quite willful juxtaposition. The book is absolutely full of lies, and I make no apologies for that, because that's not the point of it. It's not to be factual, but to somehow convey the sort of complexity of experiences that go with being in cities. And, well, appreciators of situationism will pick up all sorts of clues in there, though I wouldn't say it was actually based on situationist thinking. But certainly, if you have a page like this, which has got no buildings in it, but it does talk about the nature of experiencing movement through a city, and the complexity of the experience in its dynamic form. At one point, it proposes that you can get a very good idea of what a city has to offer you if you don't know it very well by going to the nearest newsstands and looking at the magazines that are on offer. You can pick up an awful lot about what kind of culture that place you're visiting has. And the same thing goes for looking at postcards, where postcards can reveal a great deal about the culture of the place and the way that people from outside it might grasp that or want to see it. And at the top here, we've got one place which is very near here at the time when it was dominated by a Prada advert at Centrepoint, and some other meeting places. The meeting place in Shibuya in Tokyo, where this sculpture, this bronze of a dog, which is no bigger than this, is the most famous meeting point in the city. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that that's not a building. It's not Big Ben. It's something quite discreet, but it's within popular legend of the way that city works. A page and a part of the story about the importance of brands. Now, this relationship between branding and architecture is one that, with Clive Saul, we've been exploring a bit at the Royal College. And much to the annoyance of the rector, who thought that we were dealing with something that had nothing to do with architecture, but I would claim that it has everything to do with architecture, because again, it's about brands help form the identity and lifestyle and condition of a city. And here they've been selected particularly for an association with buildings, some of which are our own, like the Taksim nightclub in Istanbul, Stonehenge, how it represents itself, the Pompidou Centre, there's an interesting one, little drawing of a building. And these people are even wearing buildings, like he's got Sydney Opera House on his shirt, and she's got Taksim, we must have paid her. And various other projects, and some that are drawn, obviously, from popular culture like Big Ben. And if you're going to survive in Ecstacity, it's important that you kind of know how to tune in to its possibilities. And in the Rome zone in particular, there's a lot of flirtation that goes on. So the book warns you a little bit how to deal with kind of unwelcome suitors. And here's some other people that seem to have more accord than the two in the black and white picture. And of course, Anita Ekberg's Fontana di Trevi is legendary all over the world as a piece of architecture which at the same time has this glamorous and amorous association that comes from Fellini's film La Dolce Vita. There are some people who like to treat their bodies as architecture, and we wouldn't necessarily all choose to advertise the way we look around the head on our backs, or to associate with kind of nationalistic interpretation of with Britannia. But even the way that this picture is taken with the two bodies opposite each other, I think there's an architectural essence in that image. And many parts of the city have large images of people that are as big as buildings. And in the Rio zone of Ecstacity, there is a great extent of beach, and on Ipanema Beach, like Copacabana, there are a series of markers along the beach that are numbered. The beaches are very long, and this Posto Nove indicates a kind of rallying point. It's a landmark along the beach, which of course is not a conventional building. It's not a work of architecture, but somehow with this numbering system and this big image, it has become an architectural condition. And particularly for those of you that know Rio, I'm sure you'll agree that the relationship between the beach and the city is an incredibly important one, a little bit like the relationship between Hyde Park or Central Park to their respective cities. And some of this fluidity, some of this desire to express movement and experience, of course, has been common to much 20th century architecture. Yesterday I was talking with Zaha, because I wrote a piece for this Sunday's Independent on Sunday, about the fact that she's about to receive the Pritzker Prize in St. Petersburg. And much of what she has done has been attempting to engage a sense of movement and layering. And this is done by the ex-Bartlett people that call their office Block. It's a bar in Shoreditch, so we're going completely kind of to the other end, that attempts to convey that sense of streaking neon that of course you can't see with your naked eye, but where the photograph of the city, where the tail lights and headlights create a visible sense of movement that signifies what we know to be true as we're in cities. Or later on in the book, where much of the book has pictures that are of cities as they now exist, it's not just trying to conform to an idea of the fantasy city. It's trying to come close to the way we experience or are beginning to experience cities now. So towards the end of the book, the framing of the images, so these abstracted forms, I see as a kind of architectural, had to have an architectural quality. You notice that the text, the principal text, is always on the right-hand side, because if you're doing a book that's this visual and this complicated, it struck me that it would be easiest to have the text always in the same place. But that means that you could play with the the rest of the page as though it itself were a space. One thing I love about books is the fact that they have a very concrete structure, that there's always that gutter down the center, the binding underneath, the ribbon emphasizes the book as an object, and that one, you know, in graphic terms, you can play with the space that is defined within the page by pushing an image off the edge, or framing it, or allowing text to float, or the image to fragment. These are all ideas that I think you'll be familiar with when trying to stretch architecture beyond the familiar object. And that leads naturally to just going over the business of framework again, the structure of the book, its rationality, its kind of its logical architectural underbelly, the initial structure that enabled the book to be put together. And you will have realized by this stage that this isn't a book that you spend August writing, you sit down and write it to the end, and then you find a load of pictures and slam them in, and somehow, hey presto, you've got image and text. No, this was a book which I guess I developed in a very similar way to developing a real architectural project, where there would be certain strata, certain conceptual strata that one would try to marry together by laying them on top of each other. And you've seen some of those already, the relation between text and image, but also many kinds of text, 4, 5, 6 kinds of text, and organized into this 6-part structure. And working with the graphic designers Why Not associates, who are ex-Royal College people that we've done a lot of work with in recent years, I was able to express the ideas that I wanted, and David Ellis at Why Not then translated much of that in graphic terms. So this combination of fonts, where I'm not sure if you can count how many fonts there are that are superimposed in that. There are 4 or 5, I'm not sure. 4. Thank you, graphic designer. But that it kind of clearly, to me, expresses the kind of multiplicity, the multiple language that is characteristic of Ecstacity. Now, this is going to be difficult for you to see because it's a chart, but no matter. Here we've got tuning in, locking on, undressing, letting go, cranking up, flipping out. And that's a kind of process. It's a series of what I call gestalts, that each of which tries to characterize a particular way of relating to a city. So tuning in, which has got a graphic of a camera lens, is about trying to imagine and prepare yourself to go to a place that you haven't been to. If you're from outside London, remember what it was like when you first came to London. The bits of information that you picked up, how you picked them up from your friends, from postcards, from websites, from hearsay, from movies you've seen. This is about anticipating that place and trying to kind of grasp it before you get there. And then we've got locking on, which is that phase when you get to know a city, or we're just beginning to get to know how to use a city, when you've figured out how to use the metro or the underground, you've figured out some of the principal landmarks, maybe like Eros and Big Ben and Marble Arch, etc. But you've also kind of made some up for yourself. Maybe Centre Point was not an obvious landmark, but you've seen it several times. And you start to realize that that is an important point of reference. And when you see it, you think you know where you are. And it's also about kind of reading maps and traveling, how to travel. The Vitesse image comes from that chapter. Undressing shifts the emphasis in the other direction and tries to point out the many ways in which your own bodies and our own communities, our own social situations, form architectural conditions that in a sense preempt the buildings that follow from them. So the condition that we're in now, of course, is a very particular one. It has a certain typology about the fact that I'm standing here talking and you're being polite enough to listen. Letting go is the point when you feel confident enough to explore a city without necessarily knowing where you're going. That you see an alleyway, you dive down there because you're curious, or you, if you're driving or on a bicycle, you deliberately go to a place that you don't know. And I think many of you will have had that pleasure of, say, exploring Venice, where so many people come back from Venice, they say, oh, I just wandered around, it was wonderful. Because they sort of knew they couldn't get lost, but at the same time got out into a complete tangle and maybe spent, you know, an hour getting to their destination more than they intended. Cranking up, which is represented by the graphic of a butterfly, is the point where you and the people that you know take on a level of creativity. So, of course, we're expected to do that as architects. But if you're not an architect, and this book is addressed as much to non-architects as it is to us, then that point of cranking up is like the character in the film said, we kind of organize our lives in such a way that we can create the unpredictable, that we can incorporate pleasure with order and rationality. And the very last section, flipping out, is, I guess, the point at which all these other five fuse together. And although the film might give you the impression that everybody in Ecstacity is under 30, which I'm not, I'm 55, so, and I'm still in it, and I'm sure there are lots of people that I know who are much older than I am who would be very comfortable in there. So that first chapter, tuning in, as I've explained, sort of shows almost the crude signs of what indicates this place. So we've got a series of souvenirs here which represent the 7 different zones in the city. Ganesh, Big Ben, the Cristo Redentor from the Rio zone, Empire State Building, which curiously is smaller than Cristo Redentor, which you might have seen recently on the front of Selfridges. I don't know, is it still there? That statue on the front of, made of foam on the front of Selfridges, but it was made by people in Rio, which I really like. And then we got pyramids for Cairo, the Colosseum for Rome, and the proposal to make a giant money cat, Maneko Nikki, which I've chosen as the symbol of the Tokyo zone. Oops, sorry. So, next chapter, locking on about finding the point, finding your references. And many of those might be buildings, large buildings, and gosh, it includes the Swiss Ray Tower. But we've got one of our students' projects of Centre Point with a gorilla on top of it, undressing, and the possibility that you could look around you and see connections between your body, other people's bodies, and what architecture is about. I mean, of course, it's a common interpretation that tower blocks and skyscrapers are phallic, but I think there are much more subtle interpretations where, say, this is that sculpture at Hyde Park Corner, which I think takes on kind of an erotic suggestion when it was covered in scaffolding, or this temple in Bombay, which I'm not trying to say is directly sexual. I think that would be naive. But in architecture, we find it very difficult to talk about the fact that there are dimensions of desire and attraction which are similar, not the same, but similar to those that we might feel between ourselves and other people. Letting go. Picture of a train in Bombay Station. And a project of our own in Canary Wharf, which supposed that this sushi bar was actually in Tokyo. So we asked these graphic designers called Designers Republic to do the backdrops for us because they were particularly fascinated by Japanese graphics. And of course it's a pose. Everybody who goes there knows perfectly well they're not in Tokyo. But I would say that this characteristic has been at the bottom of many developments in design, in design of interiors and buildings, where there is this suggestion that there's a kind of double sense of place, and that you are prepared to play the part. Cranking up. Well, this image is by a friend of mine, Ryoji Suzuki, who's an extraordinary photographer who has documented some of the most bizarre, extreme kitsch and well, it's almost squalid conditions. He did a book he called Tokyo Style, which is part of a series of books that show exquisite lifestyle in many cities around the world. But he was bad enough to show many interiors that were the complete opposite, where people in Tokyo often live in tiny rooms where they have to make hang their washing up over the bed, and they've got their speakers and sound system all around them, and the whole thing is kind of computed up, but it's got tatami mats and futon and all the rest of it. So this, of course, we've made it even more so by adding this in it, but this basic image behind is the sort of conjunction of elements that is commonplace in Japan, especially outside the confines of the big city, where perhaps as a foreign visitor you might expect the further you get it from the big cities, the more dignified the architecture would get. But this is anything but dignified, and we love it. And another of his photos with a love hotel room, where, as he explains in the text, presumably the person who's paid for the room, sits on this little throne thing, and your partner is strapped into this thing on this carpet with the arms and legs, and guess what? The bed revolves. So, flipping out. Well, she's got blood streaming down her cheek, and I can't necessarily explain why. Is there an element of violence in this phase of flipping out? Is it part of our nature to be fascinated by violence as well as sensuality? But in the centre, a drawing I did a few years ago of Manchester, should it win its then Olympic bid. Okay, so next phase. Let's look at a map. The map is actually slightly larger than this in the book because it's wider. And you're probably thinking, oh my God, they couldn't be bothered to blend one zone into another. But that's actually quite purposeful. You'll recognize that there's this map that has a river that looks remarkably familiar. I've renamed it the River Felix. Don't ask me why. I like Arabia Felix. I like the name Felix. And the river becomes remarkably close to the Lagoa, just behind Ipanema Beach, which is here. And here's Copacabana, and the FDR Drive crosses over the Atlantic Ocean. And all these maps of these 7 cities are exactly the same scale. And I ask you to think about how each one of those cities is represented in these maps. What does it tell you about the nature of those places? For example, I think rightfully at the centre is the Città del Vaticano and the Campo Marzio in Rome. Okay, that's this bit. Look how small the streets are. In fact, I'm sure you can't see them, it's just a blur. And then behind it, I've got St. Paul's Cathedral, which is part of the Westminster area, which is sort of this. And we can recognise the jolly old A to Z map, which of course we all know is a lie. We know the streets are not yellow, and we know the streets are not that wide. But what we didn't know is that Shibuya was right next to Westminster, over here. And as you'll see in a second, there is a tube station called Sloane Shibuya. And the Emperor's Palace up here, I think it's 10 kilometers round. something like that. It's a bloody nuisance when you're in Tokyo, for they're ever going round the Imperial Palace Gardens. And the same thing is true in Ecstacity. So that's all nice and tranquil and secret in there, because none of us can go in there. And then there are patches of Tokyo, these yellow bits of map, which are covered in kanji, and lots of dotted lines, which I don't understand. I don't know whether they're power lines or roads or what. And they are completely different. Look at the New York bit. How crude is that? But it's got a three-dimensional bit over here. It's got the Empire State Building and the Pan Am Building. And of course it can be represented like that because the street pattern is indeed simple, whereas in the Bombay zone, which is this bit here, you can't see the Cairo zone, which is actually off to the right. But in the Bombay zone, don't believe that the city is anything like as simple as that. Perhaps the British wanted to see it that simplistically, but it's full of alleyways and incidents that have nothing to do with that kind of Western map making. And of course there's a tube map. And well, it's such fun doing tube maps. And it's especially fun if you go on this one, because you can go from Covent Garden, say here, and if you keep going, you go past Millennium, Cannon Street, Tower Hill, Pop, Quirinale, Colosseo, Garden City, Zainab, Fusion, Atlas, Guggenheim. Or whichever way you go, you know. There's that kind of the imagination that goes with being able to get on a train and go somewhere that you couldn't do before. And this sort of mapping then could transfer in other conceptual ways, where the Lange-Bell air route map, and they did this especially for the book, I said to them, look, I want an air route map of Piccadilly, the Piccadilly area around, so here's Piccadilly Circus and Shaftesbury Avenue. So I guess Regent Street goes up like this. This is a route map of erotic destinations. And of course there's a website, and if you go into www.ecstacity.com, you come to our office, which is a bit of a letdown, but in reality that is. But there will be one day, there will be the Ecstacity website to go with the book, as is many of the images in the book work with a kind of hybridity of bringing together signs of a city. And one of the signs that developed during the process of working on the book was this Lorentz attractor, a form that is derived from chaos theory, where a point moving in space is unpredictable as to whether it will go within one circular form or jump over to the other. And I thought this was an interesting interpretation of a brand, that perhaps you could have a brand which was a moving point, which you would recognize whatever shape it was because of its nature. And so in Ecstacity, this is its brand. It always looks different every time you see it. And well, this, in a sense, the point of showing this is to return to the point of the space of the page, where this is in the last chapter of the book. It represents that Hindu festival Holi, which takes place in the spring, where everything gets covered in coloured powder. But in this chapter, we've worked with a very unfashionable idea, the idea of symmetry, that like an ink blot, that you could open the pages and you could work with that idea of the page as it falls open, doubling up the image, which is something that I find fascinating in architectural terms, how you can use symmetry to create a non-symmetrical experience. And then towards the very back of the book, we've tiled the map, so that the map you saw was that, but when you multiply it, perhaps that's the kind of effect that it might make in your mind. So to finish up, I'm just going to pick out a few key images that I haven't yet shown. early on in the book, there is the map apparently simply mapped onto this flat surface into which two digital scans of figures have been embedded. So the map appears to go over the bodies. These two bodies were scanned, and one of them is mine and one is a friend of mine, but I won't tell you which. But we've done all sorts of these things with these body scans that they were kind enough to do for us at the Bartlett, our rather university college. And they represent the so-called Mars and Venus hills. They represent a kind of starting topography that if you begin to consider a city from the point of view of the landscape that it's built on, I think you understand something special about it. And of course the same is true of London, and the way that London was established on two hills in the city of London. There are landmarks, well-known buildings in Ecstacity, and perhaps it's a conceit on my part to include these buildings as though they were very kind of plausible landmarks within Ecstacity. And of course they're from different parts of the globe, but I think each have what I would call an ecstatic character. They each have got movement, they've got a heroic drive. They also have reference to the body and movement of the body. And, well, the conceit goes even further here, because here's the Cairo Museum, which is one of the largest attractors of visitors in Ecstacity. And, of course, the Bilbao, Guggenheim, our own National Centre for Pop Music in Sheffield, now the Students' Union of Sheffield Hallam University, Kenzo Tange's Fuji Television Building, and our wall building in Tokyo, which we did as Branson Coates in 1990. Nobody understood that building really at the time. It needed time to unfold to be understood, but the idea was that the Romans had been to Tokyo and they'd built this enormous wall across most of the city, and this is the only bit that's left. Whereas in Sheffield, you know, the Martians have landed, well, you know, this is the point where you get asked questions about context. And I guess context is discontext, or it's about the rub between the new thing and the old things. They refer to the industrial past of Sheffield, of its importance as a steel-producing city, of the Bessemer converters that melted the ore and created steel. And around, on the top of each one of these drums, these cowlings which rotate, signaled by the wind, because this is a low-energy building. Air is drawn up from each one of these gallery drums and sucked out at the top by these cowlings. I think when Carlos saw this first, he called them the Yorkshire Puddings, which is stuck in my mind as probably the best name for the building. And in fact, I think when buildings have names like that, it really means they're kind of worthwhile. I don't know what the taxi drivers in Sheffield call it, but probably not so polite. And this sort of conversion of what we expect buildings to be, I think has to be understood, you know, by looking what happens around them. You know, many of us have been going on about the importance of events in architecture for years and years. But, you know, here's an event that happens every day, that you too can be in the arms of a gladiator in front of the Colosseum, and probably buy one of these on your way home. That's architecture. And, you know, as I mentioned before, the fact that we see such ginormous images of bodies in the cities that we inhabit at the moment is significant for the way in which we think of buildings. Often these hoardings are actually larger, much larger in scale than the buildings that they sit next to or sometimes on top of. And here I put the plan of the Bilbao Gires Guggenheim, because there's an obvious connection. I mean, it's not exactly a body, but it's got a body-like anatomy, physicality, which, although theoretical in the form of the plan, and that if you walk in it, you're not necessarily aware of the plan, but it's a kind of representation. And of course, we as architects have to learn to use plans in order to kind of generate our sense of three-dimensionality. I don't bother to show you a plan of this structure because the plan here would show you almost nothing, because at the ground level there was almost no structure. The structure kind of curved down to have a very small area occupying the ground. But this is one of my favorite pictures of the body in the dome when it was half built. So you see all this scaffolding around it, and you really get the feeling that this is like a Michelangelo prisoner, that it's kind of half in the rock and half not in the rock. And fortunately too, all this area in front of it is not yet finished when this picture is taken, the area that was subsequently occupied appallingly by Boots' rather nasty promotion for its creams and toothpaste and whatever. And then at the bottom, a project which was done for the Living Bridges exhibition at the Royal Academy, which I swear to you was not intended to become quite as phallic as it did, and so everybody just laughed at it, and there we go. But the energy that's in it, I think, is reflected in the work of lots of designers in London. This is a window from Harvey Nichols in Knightsbridge from a couple of years ago, done by Thomas Heatherwick, who's actually a graduate of the then furniture department at the Royal College of Art. But he's gradually beginning to do more and more architectural structures. He's done several pavilions in sculpture gardens and across Britain. And in fact, we were competing with him for a job to redesign the public space of Exhibition Road recently. Well, neither of us got it. But I just want to point out that something like this requires architectural vision, where he, with this structure, which he calls stitching, it goes in and out of the windows in a remarkably clever way, and it seems to be self-supporting. And you know, if we compare that stitching with the architecture of the building, you know, you've got to ask yourself, does the signification lie? Is it in the stuff that's in the windows, or the way that the window becomes a stage that interfaces with people walking by, driving by, sitting on buses, going past it? And the relatively dull, you know, especially if you compare it with Future Systems' new department store in Birmingham, but the relatively safe building that Harvey Nichols occupies. And this sort of play with form and scale has been one of the things that's preoccupied me. And well, this is one of my chairs, and it was done admittedly just for exhibition purposes. It was never intended to be a big production piece. It's called, and the Italians never understood this, who made it, it's called the Legover chair. Oh, Legover, that's a nice name, they would say. But of course, apart from its connotations in English, if you tip this point here, which is about this high when it's standing up in that position, if you tip that down that way, it gets to that position. And then if you roll it over, if you take that point and roll it, it gets to this position where this lovely friend of mine, Bettany, is demonstrating the endless possibilities of the Legover chair. And of course the city has those same sorts of endless possibilities. Could you possibly use this urban condition, which seems to fuse together the bursting out of wires and cables and connections with the infrastructure of motorways? And in fact, a student of ours at the college recently suggested that in the future, roadways like this will multiply because they will become pleasure lands in themselves, and that people will simply drive around these for the hell of it. And I look forward to that time of how, you know, the life in the suburbs will have that kind of simplistic form of pleasure. And then you will have heard in the film that Agip is an Italian oil company. It has a famous monster as its logo. And I actually saw this Agip gas station with a McDonald's inside it, and I thought, my God, it really is happening. But for the purposes of pushing that just that touch further there's the casino, and there's all the people going up from the car park into the casino. It's close to us, believe me. We're nearly there. Or in this image, which I've called hypologies, you heard in the film, that the suggestion is that there may be projected architectural conditions which function as a kind of community, collective focus, a focus that is more like the kinds of communities that are formed through mobile phones and the particular lifestyles of people. But all these floating things would move and change. They would grow because each one of them would be activated by our collective indication for it to move through our mobile phones, a bit like voting on TV. And I better be quick to do this because one of my rival professors is trying to do something like this with a balloon that you can make move around the city. And I would claim that this is part of what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about, you know, architectural conditions which are not necessarily solid or don't necessarily have conventional functional state of being. Well, anyway, like the guy in the film said, you know, it's all in your mind and on your tongue. And so that's my final image. And with it, I would just like you to recap a second and think, and I'm sure you've got this notion of a city being working like a very fluid three-dimensional grid, many layers that happen between yourself and what surrounds you, and about through the relationships between people outside you, between not just event and object of architecture, but the entire fluid, changing, mediatic, artificial, and sometimes incredibly real conditions that make up the cities we live in. So with that, I will finish. Thank you very much.
Good timing. So Nigel, I'm sure there'll be some questions. Maybe those people who want to leave, they could do so quickly, and then we could have some questions.
So let's go.
Let's go.
Anything I've said which you simply do not buy?
Can you take the mic?
Can I ask, when you're doing this book, you work with graphic designer, why not associate? Are they kind of helping you develop the idea of the book, or?
Very much. It was a collaboration. I think I can claim to have set the structure in place, which was obviously the body of text, but the layering also of visual information, the structure of the chapters, the need for a graphic coding for each one of the chapters. We also had a colour for each chapter. And so, you know, having established a few of the ground rules, they exploded the ideas. And I think that's how you want to work with graphic designs. Too often it's the other way around. Too often it's a struggle to get the graphics to actually come up to the same level that you're looking for. Are you a graphic designer?
I'm studying.
You're studying here? You're studying graphics? Oh, well, they're quite well known, aren't they? Why not?
Why you choose why not?
We first worked with them on the exhibition about situationists in the ICA. And that was something like, God, it was 12 years ago or so. It was in the Pompidou Centre here in London, and then went to Boston. And they started to, I mean, with the material they had, they created a lot of layering within the space so that you would get multiple messages as you moved through the displays. And in situationist work, a lot of it is to do with text, but it's also to do with text within a flow of moving through spaces. And I thought they were brilliant, and you know, that their project, in a sense, was close to ours.
So what comes after Ecstacity?
Well, I keep doing more versions of it, which is kind of a bit of a cop-out because it's been going on for years now, and it's partly because, you know, when you get a word like that, you can't let it go. It's sort of,
Right.
it's too good to...
But now you've done the big book.
Absolutely.
So you've used it
No,
for the
no.
big book.
No, it's that I'll need a little while, I think, to conceive the next container for the forthcoming ideas. But of course, it flushes out ideas. I mean, you know, you've written several books. You need to get it out of your system.
No, because I think that it's interesting in comparison to like Invisible Cities and this, because for you always this question of the imagination and thinking about something has been really quite important. And then when you talk about, let's say, your project in Sheffield, this idea of decontextualizing something and bringing an element of Ecstacity to Sheffield, there's a moment when sort of still you're left with Sheffield. Do you know what I mean? I mean, you've got your ideas of the imagination of Ecstacity, but somehow you remain with the realities of certain conditions.
Yeah, but
So-
isn't it interesting that it changed its use? Because at the time we
no,
thought...
I know about the building, but I mean in terms of
The rest of it.
the rest of the city. So there seems to be a project which is more complicated in some ways. Which
We
is the
would like to
situation-
do we would like to do projects that engage in a less material way with the city, but over a larger area that is about kind of tuning the way that a city works. And to some extent, it's been done in cities like Barcelona, where there are similar designs for objects and seats that pop up all over the city, and a similar attempt to exploit the relationship between architectural artificiality and the nature of public space. But in many respects, you're constrained as an architect to do what a client wants you to do. And as I was discussing with Zaha yesterday, if you're not permitted to do something that you would like to do, in fact, it pushes you off even more, to be even more extreme. That the success in commercial terms of designing and building does not necessarily go with its dimension of research or new possibilities. Depends how you play it.
No, but one of the things that's happened with Zaha's projects, they've got larger, so the architecture is becoming, in a sense, urban or urbanistic. What I thought always with NATO and the work that you were doing is that there's the role of them as a kind of manual for a different type of urbanism in some way, where you could really think about new sort of relationships of buildings, but except the way that buildings happen in the city or nature of organization or commissioning happens, you don't get the opportunity of actually often doing buildings in this sense of many of them at the same time. And
But
that would
it's
be an
a-
interesting thing to also
But it
try
seems to me that the project of Ecstacity is not to try to make a code book,
Sure.
which is to be followed.
Right.
It's, in many respects, it's trying to reveal an architectural imagination which is common to all of us, that it's just there if you can find it and you can see it.
Sure.
And I think, like the work of NATO, which I guess was what we put that together in 1983,
20
it's
years
more than
ago.
20 years ago. And it's astonishing to look back. I don't know if any of you know those NATO magazines. We only ever did 3. But as a vision of the city, I think it's held very well, because the basic assumption was that the city was about to be completely renewed as the docklands had been dismantled, and that with the advent of new technologies, which at that time was video cameras and rather clunky sort of electronic typewriters and telephones, maybe, not even then, there weren't mobile telephones, but if there had been, they would have been the size of bricks. But what we could get, even at that stage, was that you could work on the hoof, you could work anywhere. There was a possible separation between the container, the functional container of the building, and the way people lived in it. So it meant that the buildings could start to do all sorts of other things that were playing mental somersaults that could start to tell stories that didn't necessarily have to be there for functional reasons.
Right. Well, I guess one of the things I wanted to say, instead of also the idea of the manual, what you're saying is that for you it's the way in which this writing constructs new forms of imagination. So you see your circumstances. There's also the idea of, when you mentioned the hypnorhythmomachete polyphily, there's the idea of also certain sort of mnemonic devices, certain ways in which you can also design in a different way, reading a book like this, imagining new kinds of conditions, where it does become a sort of manual, but in a different way.
Yeah, it's a booster to
prescriptive,
confidence.
yeah, exactly.
It's a booster to confidence and enables you, I think that it sort of retreats from the prescriptive following as much as it puts it forward. And it plays with your familiarity of the city because you've read guidebooks before, you've been to places like this, and it's deliberately not wholly new. It's kind of just making something visible, is what I hope.
Nice to hear from your two former collaborators, because I think you've been, Carlos Villanueva and Mark Preisman, they were part of the 1983 period, and you've been working on your own project, so it would be nice to know how you feel the sort of deviation or unity has worked.
I think it's not one can see, so it's no great deviation. I think I just wanted to ask you about the suburban thing, because I think one of the wonderful things about what you're showing there is that if one has seen all these cities that you're talking about, which I happen to have seen all of them apart from one bed and Urban Whale and the things that you're showing, is sort of that richness, that cultural richness is so important. I mean, and one's very privileged to have had that chance somewhere. So I was intrigued when you made the comment about suburbia, because I thought, people lead very, in a sense, mundane lives to do certain things. So when you started talking about it, do you really think that we would be able to activate, kind of sort of the everyday life? Because I think one of the exciting things about what you're showing is that don't just look at your bit, remember that bit that you saw elsewhere. But I think, there is apart from architectural issues, I think there is actually a bit of a problem with actually things are very broken in places. And actually, I don't know if it's to do with education or something, it seems you were optimistic about it, I feel possibly pessimistic.
Well, I've found it difficult to embrace the idea of suburbs for a long time, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily happening yet. But isn't it interesting that we, if there's any kind of truth in what I'm saying about architecture dematerializing and becoming more sensual, more about our mental condition, then the chances are that the roles that landmark buildings in the centre of a city like London once played are no longer, you don't have to see them directly, you don't have to walk past them. Like Big Ben, you hear the chime of Big Ben on the news, and you hear it everywhere, or through the World Service. That chime has a kind of resonance, literally, and I think as it becomes a realistic possibility for buildings to grow, adapt, and respond to their users, it'll be in the suburbs where that will happen first, not in the parts of the city that are laden with history. I mean, we already see it rather nastily in the form of shed architecture. I have never been to IKEA. I'm an IKEA virgin as yet. But I actually want to go to IKEA because I know the experience is going to be horrible, but I also know I'm going to learn something about the way people assemble their lives. So let's not be naive about it, that it does, and I feel guilty of this, as many other architects ought to, that we concentrate so much of our efforts on what we think of as trying to achieve magnificence with buildings in relatively central urban conditions. Now, most of us live in within a very small part of London, and some of you probably have to travel a long way home at night, and you will get that sort of that contrast on a daily basis between living in Wood Green or Acton or somewhere like that, which is probably where many students have to live. But I'm privileged enough to live in a tiny area of London, which is, you know, it is a few square miles that I think it's kind of intolerable to cross, in a way. To go from South Kensington, where I live, to Wapping, where I work, takes me 40 minutes, whether I go on the tube or on a motorbike or whatever, in the car. It's a far. And I have to go round the congestion charge zone. But, unless I want to pay the £5. But the bit that if you come from outside London, from the countryside, and you drive into the city, and you come to the bit of the embankment, and you realise how tiny that section is that we take to be London, when in actual fact, I don't think it's like that. If you go to Southall, which is towards Heathrow, there's a world there which I tell you is alive. It's just as alive as Shoreditch or Brick Lane or many other parts of London. And that is the reason that I find London, in its biggest sense, so inspiring, that it is, in a sense, a map, a condition that reflects the whole world. Possibly London more than any of the other cities, or perhaps arguably New York. But certainly London, to me, is the place which has where more languages are spoken on a daily basis. There's more direct expression of the multicultural that we live in. Horrible word, multicultural, but it's true. We live in a time where we have to actually kind of work with that. I mean, you're from Venezuela, you're from Iran. We take this as normal, but it's actually special, and I think we've got to make use of that in architectural terms, and that includes reconsidering the suburbs, not necessarily in the depressing high street, horrible traffic jam, you know, shopping trolley world of the suburbs as they are now, but as when you just add in that extra dimension of the possibilities of a slightly more material or immaterial or responsive kind of architecture. We're just on the edge of that. That was a long answer, sorry.
I was having a problem with the way that buildings are still seen as objects. When you start with your souvenirs, and all the way that you refer to these little buildings, where that's what we're trying to do is about, if you think about cities as being one big building, so you could never really take it apart. So it's really one experiential mise en scène, actually, the city was point. And I suppose one whether you felt that if you could just rub out all the buildings in the book,
I think that would be, well, the book is not, it's not about tabula rasa at all. It's not about going back to the beginning. And I believe that we need words. You know, words are single entities, they are objects. And that we tend to think like that. So there's a bottle of mineral water, and it is an object. I'm not scared of objects, actually. But I wanted to put across that we can use substitutes for real buildings, hence the souvenirs, and that those objects you can put in your pocket or you can take back home. But it leads in the progression through the book in exactly the direction you're talking about, where through that suburban condition of cranking up, things start to dissolve, and by the last chapter there really isn't an object in sight. It's all kind of fused and overlapped. And within the sort of basic framework that I tried to structure the book according to how you might get to know how to use a city, that there would be a part, especially in chapter 2, which is about objects, landmarks, and recognizable images.
Just one more question, just out of interest. I think it's very refreshing that, you know, I call it culture just to be pompous, really, but it's all open and also involved in the way people interrelate, what they do, what they believe in, and so on. I think one of the things that's interesting there, which is something that I have many doubts about, is the relationship between dynamism, which is social dynamism, where people actually traveling, receiving, having sex, whatever it might be, and then the representation of a dynamic with a structure. So, I mean, I understand the sort of like the windows outside Harvey Nicks and the part that you show, but how do you think those two things will come together? Because I think
it affects the way you
and the other one is really actually a representation, and seem again to have great optimism that maybe one could do something.
Well, we're all constrained to be optimists, aren't we, as architects? That's part of our role. We could never just show the black side of the way cities are going. But I think it's affected the way that to think like this has affected the way I design. Say, take the wall in Tokyo. Yes, it's an object, but it's a lot of other things too. That it keys in to the very long-term dynamic sensibility, and you'll be surprised by this, but of ancient Rome, because ancient Rome is a manifestation of layers of time, of shifting architectural sense of achievement, some of which were specifically related to trying to generate movement, as in Baroque architecture and Baroque town planning. I think each time that you generate a project, you attempt to incorporate all the chemistry that you think is important to that project. And just to finish the point, let me refer to the National Centre for Pop Music, which, of course, in the picture, and the picture lies in this respect, it is for objects. But I don't think it works like that when you go there. The reason that it's for objects is because those four cylinders is because when from whichever side you approach it, you find yourself being squeezed between two of these drums. So there's no deliberate sense of inside and outside. That is dissolved. When you're in the center of it, you don't know, you quickly forget through which entrance did you come. And then you go up a staircase, and again, so the whole thing starts to rotate in your mind as a result of being there. So I'd actually disagree with the fact that that is a wholly object-orientated building. I mean, nearly everything we do is derived from a sense of choreography. And by choreography, I don't mean an absolute determinism as to how you move through a building, but a kind of framework that in some way anticipates the way you experience something, rather like a movie maker might do. And of course we have to take the photograph, and I like that one because it is so kind of rammed into the old city. And there's a bit of that explored in the book, in the text.
Any other? I think it's wonderful to see not only techniques of montage and filmmaking and cinematic issues applied to the city, but I think what you were just referring to with the Baroque. I always remember you being so fascinated with history and at the same time being so involved with the latest contemporary culture and what's happening in the city, and being involved with what's going on. And I think there are very few people that one can name who manage to really combine this interest in the ancient and the truly kind of contemporary in such a wonderful way, and it's great to have you here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming.
Are you getting good reviews of this? You're going in? Getting good reviews of this? You're going in?